For 2 years, Western governments believed they had found the pressure point. Sanction Russia's access to advanced semiconductors. Cut off the microelectronics Russia needs to build precision weapons. Make it impossible for Moscow to sustain modern warfare without Western technology. The strategy was sophisticated, broadly implemented, and appeared to be working. Russian production of certain missile types dropped. Quality control problems emerged in intercepted munitions. And then China made a decision that did not come with an announcement, did not come with a summit, and did not come with anything that could be cleanly called a policy. It came in shipping manifests. It came in trade statistics. It came in the cargo holds of vessels transiting the ports of Vladivostok and Zarubino. And what those vessels carried has the architects of Western sanctions policy staring at their models, trying to understand why everything they built is not working the way they designed it to. Welcome to States News. Subscribe and turn on notifications because what China is doing for Russia right now is not a story about diplomatic alignment or political sympathy. It is a story about economics, strategic calculation, and a decision Beijing has made about what it can gain by allowing Russia to remain capable of fighting this war. Today I'm going to show you exactly what China is transferring, why it matters more than anything Russia has received from Iran or North Korea, what it tells us about China's strategic objectives, and why the Western response to date has been insufficient in ways that are now producing measurable consequences on the battlefield. I am going to walk you through the specific categories of goods China is providing and the production capabilities they enable. Then I will analyze the economic logic driving Beijing's decision and why that logic is not going away regardless of Western pressure. Then I will examine the geopolitical calculation China is making and what it tells us about Beijing's long-term strategic vision. Then we will look at what the West has tried and why it has not worked. And finally, I will give you an honest assessment of what realistic options remain. By the time we finish, you will understand why the China-Russia economic relationship is now the single most important external variable in this conflict, and why the West's failure to address it effectively represents one of the most significant strategic failures of the entire war. To understand what China is doing, you need to understand what Russia needs. Russia entered this war with a military-industrial complex that was formidable by Cold War standards and dangerously deficient by modern ones. The Russian defense industry had significant capacity for producing large legacy platforms, tanks, artillery systems, ammunition in conventional calibers. What it lacked was domestic capacity for the microelectronics that make modern precision weapons work. Inertial navigation systems, radar seekers, digital signal processors, the computing components that sit inside cruise missiles, precision-guided shells, drone navigation systems, and electronic warfare equipment. Russia's domestic semiconductor industry had been neglected for decades and never recovered from the collapse of the Soviet system. Before the war, Russia imported these components from Western suppliers. The sanctions cut off those imports. The plan was to starve Russia's precision weapons program. What Western planners underestimated was China's willingness to fill the gap, not through overt military transfers that would trigger direct sanctions, but through the export of dual-use goods, components with legitimate civilian applications that also happen to work inside weapon systems. The category is called dual-use technology, and it is the fundamental vulnerability of any sanctions regime targeting a sophisticated industrial economy. Machine tools that can manufacture civilian automotive parts can also manufacture artillery shells. Optical components used in surveillance cameras can be integrated into drone seeker systems. Semiconductors rated for commercial telecommunications applications can, with modification, function in military electronics. The dual-use category is enormous, and the legal framework for restricting it is imperfect, even under the best enforcement conditions. China has not announced a program to supply Russia's military-industrial complex. It does not need to. What China has done is continue and in some categories expand the export of dual-use goods to Russian civilian and commercial entities, with the entirely predictable result that many of those goods have found their way into Russian weapons production. The mechanism is not secret. It is documented in trade statistics, shipping records, and analysis by research organizations including the Kiev School of Economics, the CSIS Technology and National Security Program, and the Royal United Services Institute. Their findings are consistent and alarming. Let's talk specific categories. The most significant is semiconductors and electronic components. In the 24 months following the initial Western sanctions imposition, China's exports to Russia of integrated circuits increased by over 400% by value. Machine tools and precision manufacturing equipment exports increased by over 200%. Optical components and systems more than doubled. These are not small adjustments in existing trade. These are wholesale rerouting of supply chains that Russia previously sourced from Western suppliers through Chinese alternatives. And the specifics matter. Among the electronic components documented in Russian weapons systems recovered on the Ukrainian battlefield by Ukrainian intelligence and analyzed by organizations including the Conflict Armament Research Group, Chinese manufactured components appear in quantities and categories that make accidental civilian to military diversion implausible as a complete explanation. The numbers from Conflict Armament Research are specific and worth understanding carefully. Analysis of components recovered from Russian Kh-101 cruise missiles, Shahed-136 drones modified for Russian use, and Orlan-10 reconnaissance drones has identified Chinese-manufactured microcontrollers, Chinese-manufactured sensor components, and Chinese-manufactured communication modules in production batches that post-date the imposition of Western sanctions. These are not pre-war stockpiles being drawn down. These are recently manufactured components produced in China and appearing in Russian weapons systems used in 2024 and 2025. The supply chain is active. It is current. It is working. What does this enable, concretely? It enables Russia to sustain missile production at a rate that Western analysts initially predicted would collapse under sanctions pressure. Russia's monthly cruise missile production is currently estimated by Ukrainian intelligence at 80 to 100 missiles per month, approximately 3 times the production rate that Western analysts projected as achievable without access to Western-sourced components. The difference between the projection and the reality is Chinese components. Russia's drone production, particularly of reconnaissance and strike platforms that use sophisticated navigation and sensor systems, has similarly exceeded projections by factors that can only be explained by continued access to electronic components. The sanctions worked on paper. They have not worked at the level that matters, Russian production capacity. Now let's examine why China is making this decision, because understanding the logic is essential to assessing whether Western pressure can change it. China is not doing this out of affection for Russia. Beijing and Moscow have a complex relationship with deep historical frictions, territorial disputes that both sides have agreed to set aside but never resolved, and fundamentally different visions of what a multipolar world order would look like. What China is doing is strategic calculation of a very specific kind. China wants the United States and its allies consumed, distracted, and politically exhausted by this conflict. A Russia that is fighting, surviving, and imposing costs on the West serves that interest. A Russia that collapses quickly, however satisfying that outcome might be from a Ukrainian perspective, would free Western attention, Western resources, and Western political energy for reorientation toward Asia, toward the Taiwan Strait, toward the South China Sea. China does not want that reorientation. Supporting Russia's ability to fight without directly crossing the threshold of overt military transfers that would trigger full secondary sanctions is Beijing's preferred outcome. This is not conjecture. It is consistent with every major analytical assessment of Chinese strategic behavior from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institution, and multiple European government analysis teams. Chinese officials have been remarkably explicit in private diplomatic communications leaked to various Western media organizations about the strategic logic of what Beijing euphemistically calls balanced development of China-Russia relations. The balance is not neutral. It is calibrated to keep Russia capable while keeping China deniable. What has the West tried, and why has it not worked? The United States and European Union have progressively expanded the secondary sanctions regime targeting companies in third countries that facilitate Russia's evasion of primary sanctions. Several Chinese companies have been sanctioned. Access to the U.S. financial system has been threatened for Chinese banks processing Russia-related transactions. In some specific cases, Chinese financial institutions have reduced their exposure to Russian transactions, particularly dollar-denominated ones, to avoid U.S. sanctions risk. These measures have had real effects. Chinese entities are more careful than they were. But the aggregate flow of dual-use goods has not been disrupted at the scale that would change the strategic calculation. The fundamental problem is asymmetry of leverage. The United States and Europe are significant markets for Chinese exports, but China's economic dependence on Western markets is declining as a proportion of Chinese GDP and as a strategic priority for Beijing. The threat of secondary sanctions imposes real costs on individual Chinese companies. It does not impose costs large enough or targeted precisely enough to change the decision of Chinese policymakers who have concluded that supporting Russian survival is strategically worthwhile. The West is trying to use economic tools to reverse a strategic decision that China has made for non-economic reasons. That mismatch is why the policy has underperformed. Honest analysis requires acknowledging what China has not done. Beijing has not transferred weapons systems directly. It has not provided Russia with military personnel, trainers, or advisors. It has not provided the advanced military-specific technologies, missile guidance systems, radar components, air defense systems that would represent direct military participation. The line China is walking is real. Beijing is providing enough to keep Russia viable, not enough to trigger the Western response that would impose catastrophic costs on China itself. That calibration is deliberate and so far effective. The West has not found the pressure point that changes it. What realistic options remain? Three deserve honest examination. First, sector-wide secondary sanctions targeting Chinese industries that are the primary source of Russia-bound dual-use goods, specifically the semiconductor and machine tool industries. This would be economically painful for China in ways that targeted company sanctions are not. It would also be economically painful for Western economies that rely on Chinese manufactured goods. The political will to impose symmetric pain has not existed and may not exist. Second, a direct diplomatic engagement with China offering specific inducements in exchange for measurable reductions in dual-use transfers. What inducements? That is the hard question nobody wants to answer because the options that would change Beijing's calculation all involve concessions in other areas that the West values. Third, acceleration of Ukraine's own domestic production capacity to reduce dependence on imported components for its own weapons systems, making the Russia-China relationship less strategically decisive by reducing the gap it creates. This is a longer-term strategy, and its results are already visible in Ukrainian domestic drone and weapons production, but the timescale is measured in years. None of these options is clean. None produces quick results. The China-Russia economic relationship has become the most consequential strategic partnership in this conflict, not because of military coordination, but because of economic enablement. The West built a sanctions architecture designed for a world in which China would be a passive bystander. China chose not to be passive. And the resulting gap between the intended effect of Western policy and its actual effect is now visible in the production rates of Russian weapons systems and the contents of Russian munitions on Ukrainian battlefields. The calculation is not over. China's continued willingness to accept the risks of this relationship depends on the costs remaining below a threshold Beijing has set. The West has not yet found where that threshold is, or whether the tools available can reach it. Finding that threshold and developing the will and the tools to reach it may be the most important strategic challenge the Western alliance faces in the coming year. It is a challenge that will not be resolved by battlefield results alone. States News will continue tracking the economic architecture of this conflict because the battles are decided partly by what happens at front lines and partly by what moves through the cargo holds of vessels in Vladivostok Harbor. Both dimensions matter. Subscribe if you want analysis that covers both.